I never imagined I'd walk into something so shocking in my own home. That evening, as I opened the bathroom door just a crack, I froze. My stepson, shirtless and frantic, spun around, his face pale with fear. "It's not what you think," he stammered. My heart raced, caught between leaving and confronting him. Little did I know, this moment would unravel secrets that would forever change the dynamics of our family. It had always been a house of calm routine. My husband, Henry, a dedicated architect, often worked late, pouring himself into demanding projects. His son, Blake, was a reserved and introspective 20-year-old who'd recently begun working part-time at a local hardware store while attending college. Though not overly close, Blake and I shared a polite and respectful relationship. I had always viewed him as a quiet, solitary figure, much like his father. Blake had a knack for disappearing into his own world, usually his room, where he'd immerse himself in books, music, or gaming. Our interactions were usually brief but pleasant. We had carved out a rhythm of coexistence over the years, respecting each other's boundaries without much intrusion. Henry and I had been married for 5 years, and while our relationship had its challenges, I believed we had built a stable life together. My days were a balancing act of managing work and home, often finding comfort in the small routines, making dinner, tidying up, or catching up on my favorite shows in the evening. That particular Wednesday had been no different, at least at first. I returned home late, exhausted after a long day at the office. The house was unusually quiet, with Henry still at work. Blake's truck in the driveway confirmed he was home, but the silence inside felt heavier than usual. I called out his name casually but heard no response. Assuming he was in his room, I headed upstairs to change. What I walked into next shattered that illusion of routine. The bathroom door was ajar, the faint sound of running water escaping through the gap. Blake's usual insistence on privacy made the open door all the more peculiar. I paused, unsure whether to knock or quietly walk away. But curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door just slightly. In that moment, the comfortable, predictable world I thought I knew slipped away. The Blake I saw standing by the sink, his movements frantic and his face stricken, wasn't the quiet, self-contained young man I thought I understood. There was something more, something deeper, lurking beneath his calm exterior. From that moment in the bathroom, a strange unease settled over me. Blake's startled expression, his trembling voice as he tried to explain, kept replaying in my mind. "It's not what you think," he had said, his voice strained with desperation. While I tried to reassure him and retreat to give him space, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his distress than he was letting on. Over the next few days, I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. Blake, who usually kept to himself, seemed quieter, more withdrawn. He avoided eye contact during meals and spent even more time in his room. When he did come out, he appeared preoccupied, his mind clearly somewhere else. At times, I caught him glancing at me, as though debating whether to say something. The tension between us was palpable, and it only deepened the uncertainty I felt. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't my place to pry. After all, he was a young adult with his own life and struggles. But his unease seemed to radiate through the house, its weight pressing on me. Even Henry, oblivious to the growing distance between Blake and me, began to notice the shift. "Is Blake okay?" he asked one evening as we prepared for bed. I shrugged, masking my concern. "He's just been quiet. Maybe it's school stress," I replied, though I wasn't convinced myself. The breaking point came one evening when Blake returned home late from work. His shoulders were slumped, his usual careful posture replaced with a weariness I hadn't seen before. As he walked past me to the kitchen, I noticed his hands trembling slightly. "Blake," I called out softly, trying to bridge the growing divide. He hesitated before turning, his eyes flickering with a mixture of vulnerability and shame. "Yes," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to check if you're okay." "You've seemed different lately," I said, choosing my words carefully. For a moment, he looked as though he might say something, but then he simply shook his head. "I'm fine," he replied, though the crack in his voice betrayed his words. He quickly excused himself and disappeared upstairs, leaving me standing in the kitchen, grappling with a whirlwind of emotions, concern, confusion, and an unshakable sense that something was deeply wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with questions. What had I seen in the bathroom? Why was Blake so hesitant to talk to me or anyone else? And most importantly, how could I help him without crossing boundaries? The walls of our home, once a haven of predictability, now seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of secrets. In the days that followed, I began to notice things I hadn't before: Blake's habit of avoiding his father's questions, the way his eyes darted away whenever I tried to make conversation, and the lingering heaviness in the air whenever we were alone together. It was as though we were both caught in a silent dance, each aware of the other's unease, but unwilling to speak of it. I found myself questioning everything. Was this just a phase, or was it something more? Had I intruded on a moment of vulnerability, or had I uncovered something deeper that Blake wasn't ready to share? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't ignore the growing divide between us. Whatever he was dealing with, he needed someone to reach out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had to be me. The tension between Blake and me continued to simmer just beneath the surface, like an unspoken secret that neither of us dared to address. Despite my attempts to maintain normalcy, every shared glance, every awkward silence, seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. It was as though the boundaries of our relationship had shifted, leaving us both unsure of how to navigate the new terrain. One evening, as Henry worked late yet again, I found myself alone in the kitchen preparing dinner. The hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables filled the otherwise quiet house. When Blake's truck pulled into the driveway, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and unease. He entered the kitchen moments later, his expression soft but cautious. "Hey," he greeted, his voice low. "Hey," I replied, glancing up from the cutting board. "How was work?" "It was fine," he said, moving to the sink to pour himself a glass of water. He lingered there longer than usual, as though trying to muster the courage to say something. Finally, he turned to me, his gaze hesitant. "Can I help with anything?" Surprised, I nodded toward the pot of boiling water. "Sure. Can you stir the pasta?" As he moved beside me, I noticed how close we were, closer than we'd been in weeks. The proximity felt charged, every movement exaggerated in the quiet space. When his hand brushed against mine as he reached for the spoon, I froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. Blake quickly pulled back, mumbling an apology, but I caught the faintest hint of a blush on his cheeks. "It's fine," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It happens." For the rest of the evening, our interactions were tinged with an undercurrent of something neither of us could name. At the dinner table, Blake was unusually talkative, sharing stories from work and even laughing at a joke I made. It was a stark contrast to the withdrawn young man I had seen in recent days. Yet beneath the surface, there was a lingering awareness between us, a shared understanding that something had shifted. The true turning point came a few nights later. Henry was out of town for a conference, leaving Blake and me alone for the weekend. I spent the day cleaning the house, trying to keep myself busy and avoid overthinking. As evening fell, I settled on the couch with a glass of wine, flipping through channels aimlessly. Blake appeared in the doorway, his posture tense but his expression determined. "Can I sit?" he asked. "Of course," I said, motioning to the spot beside me. He hesitated before sitting, maintaining a careful distance. For a while, we sat in silence, the glow of the television casting soft shadows across the room. Then out of nowhere he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice barely audible. "About what happened, and about us." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Blake," I started, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "Please," he said, his eyes pleading. "Let me finish." I nodded, my throat dry. "I know things have been strange between us," he continued. "And I know it's my fault. I've been acting weird, and I don't want you to think I don't appreciate you being here. He trailed off, searching for the right words. "I've always felt like I couldn't talk to anyone about what I'm going through. But that night you listened. You didn't judge me. And I didn't realize how much I needed that." His vulnerability caught me off guard, and I felt a wave of empathy wash over me. "Blake," I said softly, "I'm glad you felt comfortable enough to talk to me. You don't have to go through anything alone." He nodded, his expression a mix of relief and uncertainty. "It's just, I've never felt this close to anyone before. And it scares me." The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with unspoken emotions. I struggled to find the right words, to navigate the delicate balance between offering comfort and maintaining boundaries. "It's okay to be scared," I said finally. "But you have to trust that we can figure this out together." Blake's gaze met mine, his eyes searching for reassurance. "Do you really mean that?" "I do," I replied, my voice steady. "We'll get through this. One step at a time." In that moment, something shifted between us. It wasn't just about what had happened in the bathroom, or the tension that had followed. It was about trust, vulnerability, and the fragile bond we were building. It was unsettling and confusing, but it was also undeniably real. As the night went on, we continued to talk about his struggles, his fears, and the things he hadn't felt comfortable sharing before. By the time he stood to leave, the weight between us felt lighter, the unspoken tension replaced with a tentative understanding. The unease that had lingered for weeks finally came to a head on a quiet Saturday evening. Henry had left early for another business trip, leaving Blake and me alone once more. The day had been uneventful, but an invisible tension hung over the house. As night fell, I tried to busy myself with a book, hoping to keep my thoughts from wandering. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept drifting back to the unresolved tension between Blake and me. I was startled when I heard a soft knock at my door. Setting my book aside, I called out, "Come in." Blake stepped inside hesitantly, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He perched on the edge of the chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this," he began, "but it's been eating me up inside. I can't keep pretending everything is okay." My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for him to continue. The vulnerability in his voice was palpable, and I could sense the weight of whatever he was about to say. "Ever since that night in the bathroom," he said, his cheeks flushing, "I've felt different. I don't know how to explain it, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you." His words hung in the air like a thunderclap, shocking and heavy. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Blake looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. "I know it's wrong," he said quickly, as if trying to explain himself. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. You've been the only person who's ever really listened to me, who's ever made me feel like I matter." I felt a wave of emotions crash over me: shock, confusion, and a profound sense of unease. This was more than I had anticipated, and I wasn't sure how to respond. "Blake," I began, my voice trembling, this isn't something we can explore. It's not right." He nodded, his expression crumpling. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I had to tell you. I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore." For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of his confession settling between us. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "I understand that you're feeling a lot right now, but these feelings are complicated, and they're not something we can act on. You're young, and emotions can feel overwhelming, but they don't have to define you." Blake looked at me with tear-filled eyes. "Do you hate me?" he asked, his voice breaking. The question caught me off guard, and I shook my head immediately. "Of course not," I said firmly. "I don't hate you, Blake. But I need you to trust me when I say that this isn't the path we should take." He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to make things weird. I didn't know who else to talk to." "You don't have to apologize," I said gently. "I'm glad you felt comfortable enough to share how you're feeling. But we need to set boundaries for both of our sakes." Blake nodded again, wiping at his eyes. "I understand," he said. I don't want to lose the connection we have. You're important to me." "You're important to me too," I said softly. "And that's why we need to handle this carefully. It's okay to feel confused, but we can work through this together. You're not alone, Blake." For the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of relief in his expression. He stood then, his movements tentative. "Thank you," he said, "for listening. And for understanding." I nodded, offering a small smile. "Anytime." As he left the room, I felt a mixture of emotions: relief that the conversation had ended on a positive note, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Blake's vulnerability had laid bare a side of him I hadn't seen before, and it was clear that he was struggling to navigate his emotions. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to help him find his way, while also ensuring that we maintained the boundaries necessary to protect both of us. The following morning, I sat down with Henry, finally deciding it was time to share what had been happening. As I recounted the events of the past few weeks, I emphasized Blake's vulnerability and the importance of creating a safe space for him to express himself. Henry listened intently, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I had no idea," he said finally. "I've been so focused on work that I didn't realize Blake was struggling. I need to do better." "We both do," I said. "But it's not too late. He's opened up a little, and that's a start." That evening, Henry and Blake had a long conversation in the living room. Though I couldn't hear what was being said, I saw the change in Blake's posture. The way he leaned toward his father, the tears in his eyes as he spoke. Henry's hand rested on Blake's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that seemed to ease some of the tension. As I watched from the doorway, I felt a sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, I felt confident that we were moving in the right direction. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as a family. In the days following Blake's confession and his heart-to-heart with Henry, the house seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. On the surface, things appeared normal. Blake resumed his usual routines, attending his part-time job and school, while Henry immersed himself in work once again. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, the aftershocks of the recent revelations lingered. I couldn't help but notice how Blake carried himself differently now, quieter, more introspective. While he no longer avoided me entirely, there was a caution in his behavior, as though he was afraid of overstepping or reigniting the tension between us. It pained me to see him walking on eggshells, but I also knew that space was necessary for both of us to heal. Henry, for his part, seemed determined to be more present in Blake's life. He started coming home earlier, making a point to spend time with his son. They would watch sports together in the living room, talk over dinner, and even toss a ball around in the backyard on weekends. It was a side of Henry the first hadn't seen in years, a father fully engaged and invested. It filled me with a mix of pride and guilt, knowing that Blake's struggles had been a catalyst for this change. But not all the consequences were positive. Late at night, I would often lie awake, replaying the events in my mind. I questioned every decision I had made, wondering if I had handled things correctly. Could I have done more to support Blake? Should I have confided in Henry earlier? The weight of those questions pressed heavily on me, and sleep became a rare luxury. Blake, too, was grappling with his own guilt. One evening, while Henry was out running errands, he approached me hesitantly in the kitchen. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative. "Of course," I said, setting down the dish I was washing. He fidgeted with the edge of his shirt, avoiding my gaze. I want to apologize again. For everything. I put you in an impossible position, and it wasn't fair." "Blake," I said gently, "you don't have to apologize. You were going through something, and you trusted me enough to share it. That took courage. But I made things weird," he insisted, his voice cracking. "And now I feel like I've ruined everything." "You haven't ruined anything," I assured him. "Yes, things have been complicated, but we're working through it. The most important thing is that you're being honest about how you're feeling and taking steps to address it." He nodded, though his expression remained clouded with doubt. "I just don't want to lose the connection we had. You've always been someone I could count on." "You haven't lost that connection," I said firmly. "But it's important for both of us to respect the boundaries we've set. It's the only way we can move forward in a healthy way." Blake seemed to take comfort in my words, but the sadness in his eyes lingered. "I just hope things can go back to normal someday," he said quietly. "They will," I promised. "It might take time, but we'll get there." Over the next few weeks, the tension in the house began to dissipate. Blake started to open up more during family meals, sharing stories from work and school. He and Henry grew closer, their bond strengthening as they spent more time together. Watching them interact, I felt a sense of relief. Blake was beginning to find his footing again, and Henry was proving to be the supportive father Blake needed. Still, there were moments of lingering discomfort, fleeting glances, awkward silences, that served as reminders of the boundary we had come dangerously close to crossing. I knew it would take time for those moments to fade completely, but I was determined to stay the course, for Blake's sake as well as my own. One afternoon, Henry suggested a family outing to the lake, a chance for all of us to reconnect and create new memories. The idea filled me with both excitement and trepidation, but I agreed, knowing it was an opportunity we couldn't pass up. The day at the lake turned out to be exactly what we needed. The three of us spent hours swimming, playing games, and sharing a picnic by the water's edge. Blake seemed lighter, his laughter genuine as he joked with Henry and teased me about my lack of swimming skills. For the first time in months, the weight that had hung over our family felt noticeably lighter. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, we sat together on the shore, watching the water ripple in the evening breeze. Henry dozed off on a blanket, his snores blending with the sounds of nature. Blake and I sat a few feet apart, the silence between us peaceful rather than strained. "Thank you," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "For what?" I asked, turning to look at him. "For everything," he said simply. "For being there when I needed someone, and for not giving up on me." His words brought a lump to my throat, and I blinked back tears. "You're welcome, Blake," I said softly. "And thank you for trusting me." That means more than you know. As we packed up to leave, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in months. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like we were on the right path. Together, as a family, we were finding our way forward. In the weeks that followed our family outing to the lake, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Though the past few months had tested us in ways I never could have imagined, they also brought a deeper understanding of one another. A fragile but powerful bond forged in the wake of vulnerability and trust. Blake continued to grow and mature, showing a newfound confidence that had been absent before. He became more engaged in his studies, taking on additional responsibilities at work, and even reconnecting with old friends. The heaviness that had once shadowed his demeanor seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but a gradual shift that spoke volumes about his resilience. Henry, too, became more attentive, not just to Blake, but to me as well. He made an effort to carve out time for us as a family, planning dinners, movie nights, and other small moments that reminded me of why I fell in love with him in the first place. For so long, his career had been his sole focus, but now he seemed to understand that being present for his family was just as important. As for me, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, the choices I made, the boundaries I set, and the lessons I learned. I realized that sometimes, the most difficult situations force us to confront parts of ourselves we'd rather avoid. I had always thought of myself as someone who had all the answers, but this experience taught me the importance of humility and grace. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, laughing at one of Henry's jokes, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Our family wasn't perfect, and we never would be, but we had weathered a storm together. We had faced our flaws, our fears, and our mistakes and emerged stronger for it. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the lessons I hoped Blake would take from this experience. Life is messy and complicated, and emotions aren't always easy to navigate, but it's how we handle those challenges that defines us. I hoped he understood that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, but of strength. That vulnerability, while scary, is the first step toward growth and healing. I also thought about the importance of boundaries, of knowing when to step in and when to step back. It was a delicate balance, one that I was still learning to navigate. But I was committed to creating an environment where Blake could feel supported without compromising the integrity of our family dynamic. As time went on, the lingering tension from those difficult months began to fade, replaced by a sense of normalcy that felt hard-earned and deeply cherished. Blake and Henry grew closer, their bond stronger than it had ever been. And while my relationship with Blake remained complex, it was also marked by mutual respect and understanding. We had found a way to move forward, not by erasing the past, but by learning from it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Blake joined me on the porch where I sat sipping tea. "You've been quiet today," I said, glancing over at him. "Just thinking," he replied, his gaze fixed on the fading light. "About what?" "About how far we've come," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's been a lot, but I think we're better for it." I nodded, my heart swelling with pride. "We are," I said. "And I'm proud of you, Blake, for facing everything head-on, and for being willing to grow." "Thanks," he said, his smile widening. "That means a lot." As we sat in comfortable silence, I felt a deep sense of peace. The journey we had been on was far from easy, but it had taught us valuable lessons about love, trust, and resilience. It had shown us that even in the face of life's messiest moments, there is always a path forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly hopeful about the future. In the weeks following our day at the lake, the atmosphere at home began to feel lighter. The tension that had once felt insurmountable slowly gave way to a sense of healing and renewal. Blake was opening up more, not just to me but to Henry as well. Their relationship, once strained by distance and misunderstandings, had evolved into something more meaningful. Henry was making a conscious effort to be present, and Blake responded in kind, seeking out his father's advice and engaging in conversations that had once felt forced. For my part, I focused on maintaining the balance we had worked so hard to restore. I was careful not to overstep, giving Blake the space he needed to process his emotions and build his confidence. Our interactions were friendly but measured, guided by the boundaries we had set. While the memory of his confession lingered, it no longer defined our dynamic. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far we had come and the importance of open, honest communication. One evening, as we sat together for dinner, Henry brought up the idea of planning a family trip, a chance to create new memories and strengthen our bond even further. Blake's eyes lit up at the suggestion, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for the progress we had made. "That sounds great," Blake said, his voice carrying a note of excitement I hadn't heard in months. "It'd be nice to get away for a bit." As we discussed potential destinations, I realized just how much had changed. The guarded, withdrawn young man who had once hesitated to engage was now actively participating in the conversation, his laughter and smiles coming easily. It was a stark contrast to the tension that had once filled our home. Later that night, as I sat alone on the couch, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The challenges we had faced had been daunting, and there were moments when I had doubted whether we would ever find our way back to normalcy. But through patience, understanding, and a commitment to each other, we had managed to rebuild what had been fractured. I thought about Blake's confession, the vulnerability he had shown, and the courage it had taken for him to seek help. It wasn't easy for anyone to admit they were struggling, let alone a young man navigating the complexities of adulthood. His willingness to open up had been a turning point, not just for him, but for our entire family. Looking back, I realized that the experience had taught me valuable lessons about trust, empathy, and the importance of setting boundaries. It had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths and navigate difficult emotions, but it had also strengthened my resolve to be a source of support for those I cared about. Life was messy, unpredictable, and often challenging, but it was also filled with moments of growth and connection that made the struggles worthwhile. The next morning, as I prepared breakfast, Blake entered the kitchen with a smile. "Morning," he said cheerfully, reaching for a cup of coffee. "Morning," I replied, smiling back. "How'd you sleep?" "Pretty well," he said, his tone light. "I've been thinking about the trip. I think it's a great idea." "Me too," I said. "It'll be nice to spend some quality time together." As we chatted about potential plans, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. The shadows of the past were still there, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Instead, they served as a testament to our resilience and the strength of our bond. When Henry joined us a short while later, the three of us sat down to eat together, the conversation flowing easily. It was a small moment, but it carried a weight of significance. We had faced challenges that could have torn us apart, but instead, they had brought us closer. As I watched Blake laugh at one of Henry's jokes, I felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. Our family wasn't perfect, no family was, but we were learning, growing, and moving forward together. And in the end, that was all that mattered. If you were in her shoes, how would you handle such a delicate situation? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories that dive into life's most unexpected twists and turns. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. It's one you won't want to miss.